Blood soaked through the wolf pelts on the war table, dripping onto the stone floor in slow, heavy drops. Somewhere beyond the iron gates of Blackridge Keep, the last howls of the border battle were still echoing through the hills. Inside, the great hall had turned into chaos. Guards shouted orders that contradicted each other. A young enforcer wept openly near the doorway, his hands shaking too badly to hold his spear, and in the center of it all, laid across a long oak table meant for feasts, was Alpha King Roran Voss, his right hand nearly cut from his wrist. The wound was ugly. A rogue enforcer from the northern packs had struck him during the retreat, a blade meant to cripple rather than kill, and it had nearly done its job. Roran's face was pale, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped beneath his skin, yet he made no sound. Kings did not scream, even when their bodies begged them to. "Where is old Ferris?" someone shouted. "Get the healer, now." "He left for the eastern village 3 days ago," a guard answered, panic cracking his voice. "He won't be back before nightfall." "Then find someone else. Anyone. The king is losing too much blood." A young girl, barely past her first shift, backed against the wall in horror as she watched crimson spread across the table like spilled wine. The pack's second healer had broken her arm the week before and could do nothing but call out instructions from a chair, her voice thin and useless against the panic in the room. It was Callum, one of Roran's personal guards, who remembered her. He remembered the quiet woman who lived just past the tree line, on the border between wolfland and human land, the one villagers spoke of in careful whispers. They said her herbs could close wounds that should have festered for weeks. They said she had saved a child bitten by a viper when no one else believed the child would live through the night. The herbalist, Callum said suddenly. The human woman. Marsh. The pack's senior council member, an older wolf named Edmund, turned on him with a snarl. "A human? In the keep? Are you out of your mind?" "She's the only one who can help him," Callum said. "Ferris himself has spoken of her skill. We don't have time to argue." Roran, through the haze of pain, lifted his head slightly. His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of command even now. "Bring her." No one argued with the king, not even half-conscious and bleeding across a table. Elira Marsh was kneeling in her garden when the wolves came for her, her hands buried in soil, tending to a patch of yarrow she had been nursing back to health after a harsh frost. She heard the sound before she saw them, a low rumble of paws against packed earth, fast and urgent, and her heart lurched into her throat. She had lived long enough near wolf territory to know the difference between a hunting pack and a pack on a mission. This was the second kind, and it was heading straight for her cottage. By the time 3 enforcers shifted into their human forms at her fence line, she was already backing toward her door, her pulse hammering. She had heard stories. The kind mothers told their children to keep them from wandering too close to the border. Stories about what happened to humans who crossed into wolf territory uninvited, and what happened to humans the wolves decided to invite in themselves. Elira Marsh, the tallest of the 3, said, his tone clipped and urgent rather than threatening. "You are needed at Blackridge Keep. The Alpha King has been gravely wounded. We were told you may be able to save him." Elira's mouth went dry. "Me? I'm a village healer. I treat fevers and broken bones, not—" "There is no time," the man said, and something in his eyes, a flicker of genuine fear, made her stomach twist. "If he dies, everything changes. For your village too, please." She thought of refusing. She thought of every warning she had ever heard about entering a wolf stronghold, as a human woman, with no pack, no protection, and no standing. But she also thought of the children in her village, of the fragile peace that had held between the wolves and the humans for the past decade, a peace she had heard could shatter the moment a king fell without an heir, ready to take his place. She grabbed her leather satchel from beside the door, the one filled with dried herbs, clean linen, and the small collection of tools she used for stitching wounds, and followed them into the trees. The ride to Blackridge Keep felt like it lasted forever, though it likely took less than 20 minutes. Elira was seated behind Callum on a borrowed horse, gripping the saddle so tightly her knuckles ached, watching the dark shapes of the forest blur past. When the keep finally came into view, rising out of the hillside like something carved from the mountain itself, she felt her breath catch. She had never seen it up close. From the village, it was only a distant silhouette against the sky. Now, towering stone walls loomed over her, and iron gates groaned open to let them through, revealing a courtyard filled with anxious wolves in both human and shifted forms, all of them turning to stare at the human woman being escorted into their home. "Move," Callum said, half pulling her from the horse the moment they stopped. "This way, quickly." Inside the great hall, the scene that greeted her was worse than anything she had imagined. The king lay across the table, his skin ashen, his right hand barely attached to his wrist by torn muscle and skin. Blood had pooled beneath him, soaking into the wooden grain. A woman with a splinted arm was shouting instructions that no one seemed to be following correctly, and 2 guards were pressing cloth against the wound with far too much force, doing more harm than good. Illyra's training took over before her fear could stop her. "Move aside," she said, her voice sharper than she expected. When no one moved fast enough, she pushed past them herself. "I said move." Something about her tone, the sudden authority in a room full of panicking wolves, made even Edmund step back. She set her satchel down and pulled out clean linen, a small vial of crushed yarrow mixed with honey, and a curved needle she used for closing deep wounds. Her hands, which had been shaking only minutes before, steadied the moment they touched the king's ruined arm. "I need boiled water," she said without looking up. "Now?" And someone hold his shoulders still. "He's going to fight this whether he means to or not." The guards scrambled to obey. Even Edmund, who had spat at the idea of a human touching his king only minutes earlier, found himself fetching a basin from the kitchen without being asked twice. Roran's eyes were half open, glassy with pain and blood loss, but he was aware enough to feel a stranger's hands on his ruined arm. He turned his head slightly, focusing what little strength he had left on the woman leaning over him. She was human. That much was obvious from her scent alone. Earthy and floral. Nothing like the sharp musk of wolves. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid during the ride, framing a face set with fierce concentration. He should have been furious. A human touching an alpha king was practically unheard of, an insult by tradition alone. But the pain radiating from his arm was so overwhelming that he found he did not care. If this woman could stop the fire spreading through his veins, she could touch him however she needed to. "This is going to hurt," Illyra murmured, more to herself than to him, as she began cleaning the wound with careful, steady strokes. "I need you to stay as still as you can." Roran let out a breath that might have been a laugh, if he had the strength for one. "I have survived worse." "I doubt that," she said without thinking, then immediately flushed at her own boldness, speaking so freely to a king, but he did not seem offended. If anything, the corner of his mouth twitched, the barest ghost of amusement even through the pain. She worked quickly after that, cleaning away torn flesh and debris from the wound, applying the yarrow paste to slow the bleeding, and beginning the long, careful work of stitching muscle and skin back together. The wound was deep enough that she doubted, privately, whether the hand could be saved at all. Werewolves healed faster than humans, she knew that much from stories, but even wolf healing had limits, and this injury was close to one of them. The hall had gone eerily quiet, every wolf present watching in tense silence as the human woman worked on their king with steady, practiced hands. No one dared speak, no one dared breathe too loudly. And then it happened. As Illyra pressed her palm flat against the stitched wound to hold the last bandage in place, a strange warmth bloomed beneath her skin, spreading outward from her palm like sunlight breaking through clouds. She gasped, nearly pulling away out of pure instinct, but something kept her hand exactly where it was. Beneath her fingers, she felt the torn muscle knit itself together with unnatural speed. The angry red edges of the wound, moments ago raw and swollen, began to smooth and close before her eyes. What should have taken days of careful wolf healing happened in the span of a few heartbeats. Roran's breath caught sharply. He felt it too, a wave of heat rushing up his arm, chasing away the searing pain that had consumed him since the battle. He lifted his head, staring in disbelief as his hand, still wrapped in bloodied linen, visibly stopped throbbing beneath the bandage. No one in the room said a word. Edmund's mouth had fallen open. Callum had gone very still by the door. Even the injured healer in the chair had stopped giving instructions, staring at the scene with wide, unblinking eyes. Illyra slowly lifted her hand away, and beneath it, where jagged, torn flesh had been only moments before, the skin was smooth. Not perfectly healed, not yet. The wound was still closed with careful stitches, but the swelling had vanished entirely, and the deathly gray pallor had drained from Roran's face, replaced by healthier color returning to his cheeks. "What?" Edmund said slowly, breaking the silence. "Was that?" Illyra stared down at her own hand, as though it belonged to someone else. "I don't know," she whispered. That has never happened before." Roran, propped up now on his uninjured arm, studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. His pain had eased so suddenly, so completely, that for a moment, he wondered if he had already died, and this was some strange, undeserved mercy given to him in the afterlife. But no, the hall was still around him, the scent of blood and fear still thick in the air, and the woman kneeling beside him was very real. "Your name," he said quietly, his voice steadier now than it had been in an hour. "Tell me your name." "Illyra," she managed. "Illyra Marsh." He held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his dark eyes. "Illyra Marsh," he repeated slowly, as though testing the shape of the words. "You have just done something I did not think possible." Before she could respond, his eyes rolled back, and his body went slack, the sudden absence of pain, and the exhaustion of blood loss, finally pulling him under. Illyra caught his shoulder before his head could strike the table, panic flooding back into her chest. "He's fainted," she said quickly, before anyone could mistake it for something worse. "He needs rest, warmth, and food when he wakes. His body just healed itself faster than it should have been able to. That takes strength from somewhere." Edmund studied her with narrowed eyes, suspicion, and something close to awe warring across his weathered face. "You will stay," he said, not quite a request. "Until the king wakes and decides what is to be done with you." Illyra swallowed hard, looking down at her hand again, the same hand that only a night before had been pulling weeds from a garden, and was now, somehow, wrapped in a mystery she did not understand. She had no idea what she had just done, or why it had happened, only that the moment her skin had touched his wound, something ancient and unexplainable had passed between them. Whatever it was, she had a feeling her quiet life at the edge of the forest had just ended, and something far larger, and far more dangerous, had only just begun. Illyra did not sleep that night, though she was given a small room near the healer's quarters, and a bed softer than anything she owned at home. She sat by the narrow window instead, watching torchlight flicker across the courtyard below, her mind circling the same impossible moment over and over. The warmth, the way the wound had closed beneath her palm as though her touch alone had rewritten what should have happened. She pressed her hand against her own arm, half expecting to feel that same strange heat again, but there was nothing, just her own steady pulse. By morning, word of what had happened in the Great Hall had spread through every corner of Blackridge Keep. Servants whispered as they passed her door. Guards who had been posted outside her room the night before, ostensibly for her protection, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and unease when she finally stepped into the corridor. She was not a prisoner, not exactly, but she was not free to leave either, and everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to decide what she was. She was escorted to the healer's chamber first, a bright, high-ceilinged room lined with shelves of dried herbs and clay jars, far better stocked than her own modest cottage. There, she found the injured healer from the night before, a woman named Miriam, resting in a chair with her splinted arm propped on a cushion. "You're the one," Miriam said, the moment Illyra stepped inside, her sharp eyes studying her with open curiosity rather than suspicion. "The one who mended him. I helped stitch the wound," Illyra said carefully. "I don't know about the rest." Miriam let out a short laugh, though it clearly pained her ribs to do so. "Modesty won't save you from what's coming, dear. Half this keep is convinced you're a witch. The other half thinks you're a miracle. Neither is going to leave you alone." Illyra sank into the chair across from her, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "I don't want to be either of those things. I just wanted to help him." "I believe you," Miriam said, more gently now. "For what it's worth, I've tended wolves my whole life. healed wounds that should have killed strong men twice over. I have never seen anything close to what you did last night. Whatever it wasn't ordinary skill. You should be careful who you tell that to, and how. Before Alira could respond, a sharp knock echoed against the door, and a young attendant entered, her expression tight with nerves. The king is awake, she announced. He is asking for the healer. Both of you. Roran was sitting upright when they entered his chamber, a room far grander than anything Alira had ever set foot in, with high stone walls draped in dark tapestries and a fire crackling in a hearth large enough to roast an entire boar. He looked remarkably well for a man who had nearly lost his hand less than a day before. His color had returned fully, his eyes sharp and alert, though his right arm remained wrapped in linen, resting carefully against his chest. When his gaze landed on Alira, something in his expression shifted, an intensity she couldn't quite name settling over his features. "Leave us," he said to the attendants gathered near the door, all but the healer. Miriam bowed her head and exited without argument, though she gave Alira a small, encouraging nod on her way out. The guards followed, until only Roran and Alira remained in the vast chamber, the fire crackling softly between them. "Sit," Roran said, gesturing to a chair near the hearth. When she hesitated, he added, more gently, "Please." She sat, perched carefully on the edge of the seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I want to see it," he said, without preamble. "The hand. I want you to unwrap it and tell me what you see." Alira crossed the room slowly and, with careful fingers, began unwinding the linen bandage from his wrist. As the layers fell away, she felt her breath catch. The stitches she had placed the night before were still there, small and neat, along a line of pink, healing skin. But there was no swelling, no sign of infection, no trace of the deep, ragged wound that had nearly severed his hand entirely. It looked, impossibly, like an injury weeks old rather than hours. "This isn't normal," she said quietly, "not even for a wolf. I've heard your kind heals fast, but this is impossible," Roran finished for her. "Yes, I am aware." He flexed his fingers slowly, testing the range of motion, wincing only slightly at the stiffness of newly formed tissue. Then his eyes lifted to meet hers, steady and searching. "Tell me what happened when you touched me," he said. "Not what you think I want to hear. The truth." Alira hesitated, unsure how to explain something she barely understood herself. "I felt warmth," she finally said, "starting in my hand, spreading down my arm. It wasn't like anything I've felt before. I've bandaged 100 wounds in my life, Your Majesty. Nothing has ever done that." "Has this happened before, with other patients?" "Never," she said firmly. "I would know. I would have noticed." Roran studied her for a long moment, his gaze so intense that she had to fight the urge to look away. There was something unsettling about being seen that closely by someone so powerful, someone who could, with a single word, decide her fate entirely. "My council believes you may be dangerous," he said eventually. "Some believe you used dark magic. Others believe you are simply gifted, though gifted humans with abilities like yours are rare enough to be nearly unheard of. I do not know which is true, but I know this. You saved my life last night, and whatever power moved through you, it answered to no one but itself. That is not something I take lightly." "What happens to me now?" Alira asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. Roran considered the question carefully before answering. "You will stay here, under my protection, until we understand what happened between us. I will not have my council decide your fate through fear and gossip. If there is something unusual about you, I intend to understand it properly, not punish you for something you cannot explain." "And if I want to go home?" she asked, surprising herself with her own boldness. Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to name. "You may request it, but I would ask you to stay, at least until we know more, for your own safety as much as mine. There are those in this keep who will not take kindly to what happened last night, no matter how it saved me." Alira thought of her cottage at the edge of the forest, her garden full of half-tended herbs, the quiet, predictable life she had built for herself over the years. She thought, too, of the strange warmth that had passed between her palm and his ruined flesh, a mystery that pulled at her curiosity as much as it frightened her. "I'll stay," she said finally. For now. Roran nodded slowly, something like relief passing briefly behind his eyes, before his expression settled back into careful neutrality. Then it is decided. You will be given quarters near the healer's wing, and guards for your protection, whether you feel you need them or not. I will not have anyone in this keep treat you as anything less than a guest. As Alira turned to leave, his voice stopped her at the door. Alira, he said, and the sound of her name in his voice, low and deliberate, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Thank you. Whatever you did last night, I owe you my hand, and likely my life. She turned back, offering a small, uncertain smile. I only did what any healer would do. No, Roran said quietly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You did something no healer in this land has ever done. I intend to find out why. Alira left the chamber with her heart pounding, unsure whether it was fear or something else entirely settling low in her stomach. Behind her, Roran remained by the fire, flexing his healed hand slowly, staring at the smooth, unscarred skin where a mortal wound had been only hours before. Whatever Alira Marsh was, ordinary healer or something far stranger, he intended to keep her close until he understood it completely, and though he would not admit it, not even to himself, some part of him hoped the answer would take a very long time to find. 3 days after the king's recovery, Alira learned that surviving a wolf attack was far easier than surviving the politics that followed one. She had been given a modest room near the healer's wing, simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the eastern garden. A guard stood outside her door at all times, though whether he was there to protect her or watch her, she could not say for certain. She was summoned to the council chamber that morning, a request delivered not by a gentle attendant, but by 2 stern-faced enforcers, who made it clear refusal was not an option. The chamber itself was intimidating, a circular room with a long stone table and a dozen wolves seated around it, all watching her enter, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Edmund sat near the head of the table, his weathered face set in its usual stern lines. Beside him sat a woman Alira had not yet met, striking and sharp-eyed, with dark red hair pinned elegantly away from a face that held none of the warmth Alira had hoped to find in this place. She studied Alira the way a hawk studies something small and vulnerable in the grass. Sit, Edmund said, gesturing to the single empty chair positioned at the far end of the table, isolated from the rest. Alira sat, keenly aware of every eye in the room fixed on her. We have called you here, Edmund began, to discuss what happened 3 nights ago, and what it means for this pack going forward. I already explained everything to the king, Alira said carefully. You explained what you experienced, the red-haired woman interjected smoothly. That is not the same as an explanation of what you are. Seraphine, Edmund said, a note of warning in his tone, though the woman did not look particularly chastened. I am simply asking the question everyone in this room wishes to ask, Seraphine continued, her gaze never leaving Alira. You are human. Humans do not possess healing gifts of this nature. There are old stories of witches who bargained with dark forces for such power. Is that what you are, Alira Marsh? A witch? I am not a witch, Alira said, keeping her voice steady, despite the anger rising in her chest. I am a healer. I have used herbs and stitches to treat wounds since I was 14 years old. What happened with the king was not something I did on purpose. It happened to both of us. How convenient, Seraphine murmured, though loud enough for the whole table to hear. That is enough, Edmund said sharply, silencing the murmurs that had begun to ripple around the table. Whatever her nature, the king has taken personal responsibility for her safety within these walls. Until he decides otherwise, she will not be treated as a suspect in this chamber. Seraphine's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, though her cold gaze remained fixed on Alira for the remainder of the meeting. Alira would later learn, from Miriam's careful whispers, exactly why Seraphine seemed to despise her so quickly. Seraphine had spent years positioning herself as the most likely candidate to stand beside Roran as his queen, cultivating alliances among the pack elders, ensuring her family's influence grew steadily within the keep. A human woman with an unexplained power over the king's very body was not a rival Seraphine had ever anticipated, and she clearly did not intend to accept the threat quietly. Life within the keep settled, slowly, into an uneasy rhythm over the following weeks. Illyra spent her mornings assisting Miriam in the healer's chamber, grateful for the familiar work of grinding herbs and preparing salves, work that steadied her mind even as the rest of her circumstances remained deeply unfamiliar. In the afternoons, she found herself, more often than not, summoned to walk the gardens with Roran, ostensibly so he could monitor the healing progress of his hand, though the visits stretched longer each time, filled with conversation that had little to do with medicine at all. She learned that Roran had become Alpha King at a young age, following his father's sudden death in a border conflict much like the one that had nearly claimed his own life. She learned he carried the weight of that early loss carefully, rarely speaking of it, though it shaped the careful, guarded way he approached every decision affecting his pack. He was not the cold, ruthless figure she had expected from the stories humans told of wolf kings. He was thoughtful, occasionally dryly funny, in a way that caught her off guard, and unfailingly attentive to the well-being of those under his protection, wolf and human alike. "You're staring," Roran said one afternoon, as they walked along the garden path lined with late-blooming roses, his healed hand flexing absently at his side. "I'm not staring," Illyra said, though a small flush crept up her neck. "I'm observing. There's a difference." "Is there?" A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "What have you observed, then, in your professional capacity as my healer?" "That you flex your hand when you're thinking hard about something," she said. "You've been doing it for the last 10 minutes. He glanced down at his hand, as though noticing the habit for the first time, then back at her with something like surprise. "I hadn't realized." "What are you thinking about?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question, unsure whether it crossed some invisible line she wasn't supposed to test. Roran was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the distant tree line beyond the garden wall. "My advisor has been searching through old pack records," he said finally, "trying to find any mention of a human possessing an ability like yours. He believes there may be something in the archives, old stories passed down before my grandfather's time. I am not certain what to hope for. An answer might explain what happened between us. It might also complicate things further than either of us can imagine." Illyra felt a small chill despite the warm afternoon sun. "What kind of complications?" "I don't know yet," Roran admitted. "But I have learned, over the years, that old pack legends rarely stay simple once they resurface." They walked in silence for a while after that, the weight of his words settling between them. Illyra found her thoughts drifting, unbidden, to the strange warmth that had passed through her palm that first night, and to the way her chest had tightened, inexplicably, every time she had been near him since. She told herself it was simple curiosity, the natural fascination of an unexplained mystery. She was not entirely certain she believed herself. That evening, as Illyra returned to her quarters after a long day assisting Miriam with a difficult birth in the eastern village, she found Seraphine waiting near her door, arms crossed, expression carefully composed into something almost pleasant, though her eyes remained cold. "A moment of your time," Seraphine said, though it was not phrased as a request. Illyra paused, wary. "Of course." "I want to be honest with you," Seraphine said, stepping closer, her voice low enough that the guard down the hall could not overhear. "I do not trust you. I do not believe your presence here is as innocent as you and the king seem to think it is. But I am not a foolish woman, and I understand that direct hostility will accomplish nothing while he continues to protect you so closely." "I never asked for his protection," Illyra said carefully. "Perhaps not," Seraphine said, something sharp flickering behind her composed expression. "But you have it, regardless, and I would advise you, healer, to remember exactly what you are within these walls. A guest, a curiosity. Nothing more, no matter what strange power flows through your hands. This pack has traditions that stretch back centuries, traditions that do not include human women standing beside their king as anything more than a passing fascination." "Is that a threat?" Illyra asked, refusing to let her voice waver, despite the unease curling in her stomach. Seraphine's smile did not reach her eyes. "It is a kindness. Enjoy your stay here, Illyra Marsh, however long it lasts." She swept away down the corridor without another word, leaving Illyra standing alone outside her door, her heart pounding with an emotion she couldn't quite name, something caught between anger and a deep, unsettling apprehension about exactly how far Seraphine might go to protect the future she believed she was owed. The scream came from the banquet hall just after sunset, sharp and sudden, cutting through the low murmur of the evening meal like a blade. Elira was in the herb garden gathering the last of the season's chamomile when she heard it, and her body reacted before her mind fully understood what was happening, dropping her basket and running toward the sound without a second thought. By the time she reached the great hall, chaos had already taken hold. Roran was slumped in his chair at the head of the long table, his face slick with sweat, his breathing shallow and ragged. Miriam was already at his side, her splinted arm forgotten as she pressed trembling fingers against his throat, checking his pulse with growing alarm. "What happened?" Elira demanded, pushing through the gathered guards. "He collapsed," Miriam said, her voice tight with fear. Mid-conversation. One moment he was speaking, the next he simply fell forward. His pulse is racing far too fast, and his skin is burning. "Poison," Elira said immediately, kneeling beside him, her trained eyes scanning the symptoms with rapid, practiced assessment. Rapid pulse, dilated pupils when she carefully checked his eyes, trembling in his limbs that had nothing to do with cold. Someone poisoned him. What did he eat? What did he drink? "Wine," a guard said, his voice shaking. "From his own cup, the one poured only for him." Edmund arrived moments later, his face ashen as he took in the scene. "Find out who had access to that wine," he barked at a pair of enforcers, who scrambled to obey. "Search the kitchens. No one leaves the keep tonight." Elira had no time to think about who might be responsible. Her focus narrowed entirely to the man convulsing gently beneath her hands, his usually steady breathing now coming in short, panicked gasps. She had seen poison before, treated it in the village on rare occasions, but never anything that acted this fast, this violently, against a body known for its resilience. "We need to purge whatever is left in his system," she said, working quickly to mix a solution from the herbs in her satchel, though her hands trembled slightly as she measured doses meant for a human frame, not a wolf's far larger and more resilient one. "Miriam, help me get him upright. We need to get this into him before it spreads further." Together, they managed to get a bitter mixture of activated herbs into Roran's mouth, coaxing him to swallow despite his labored breathing. He vomited within minutes, his body violently rejecting what remained of the poisoned wine, but by then the toxin had clearly already begun spreading through his bloodstream, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that mirrored the night Elira had first seen him wounded. "It isn't enough," Elira murmured, watching his breathing grow shallower despite their efforts. "The poison is already in his blood. Herbs alone won't pull it back out fast enough." She thought, briefly, of walking away, of admitting there was nothing more she could do, letting Miriam and the pack's more experienced healers take over from here. But something in her refused to accept that outcome, a fierce, protective instinct rising in her chest that had little to do with professional duty and everything to do with the man himself. Without fully understanding why, she reached out and took Roran's hand in both of hers. The warmth came instantly this time, faster and stronger than it had the first night, spreading up her arms like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She felt it pulling something from deep inside her, an exhausting, draining sensation, but she held on, refusing to let go, even as her own vision blurred slightly at the edges. Beneath her hands, Roran's ragged breathing began to slow, deepening into something steadier. The gray pallor slowly receded from his skin, color returning gradually to his cheeks. His trembling stilled. Around them, the room fell into stunned silence once again, guards and council members alike watching in disbelief, as the same impossible healing they had witnessed weeks before repeated itself before their eyes. By the time Roran's eyes fluttered open, his breathing had returned entirely to normal, and the fever that had gripped his body only minutes before had broken completely. "Elira," he rasped, his voice hoarse but clear, his gaze finding hers immediately, as though she were the only steady point in a room that had briefly spun out of control around him. "You're going to be all right," she said, though her own voice trembled with exhaustion, her hands still wrapped tightly around his. "The poison is gone. I don't know how, but it's gone." Edmund stepped forward slowly, his expression a complex mixture of relief and something closer to reverent fear, as he stared at the scene before him. "This is the second time," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Twice now. Her touch has undone what should have killed him." Roran, still weak but alert, squeezed Alira's hand gently, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Thank you," he murmured, so quietly it was meant only for her. Again. Later that night, once Roran had been settled in his chamber under careful watch, and the kitchens had been thoroughly searched without turning up any immediate answers about who had tainted the wine, Edmund summoned his oldest advisor to the private study rather than the full council chamber. Alira, exhausted but unable to sleep, sat quietly in the corner of the room as the elderly wolf, a scholar named Gideon, who rarely left the keep's ancient archive, spread a collection of yellowed scrolls across the desk. "I began searching after the first incident," Gideon explained, his voice raspy with age, his fingers tracing careful lines of faded ink. The healing alone was unusual enough to warrant investigation, but tonight's events confirmed something I suspected, but hoped, frankly, was mere superstition. "What did you find?" Edmund asked, leaning over the ancient text with visible impatience. Gideon tapped a particular passage, written in a script so old that Alira could not begin to decipher it. There are references, scattered across several generations of pack history, to something the old wolves called a mender, a rare human soul, bonded by fate rather than choice, capable of healing wounds and ailments that would otherwise prove fatal to an alpha, and an alpha alone. The bond is described as rare beyond counting, appearing perhaps once in several centuries, and always between a mender and the pack's true leader. Alira's chest tightened. "You're saying this has happened before? To other kings?" "According to these accounts, yes," Gideon said, though the last recorded instance was well over 200 years ago. The bond, from what I can decipher, only fully forms and stabilizes if both parties choose it freely, of their own will. Until that choice is made, the connection remains fragile, appearing only in moments of dire need, as we have now witnessed twice. "And if the bond does form fully," Edmund pressed, "what then?" Gideon's expression turned grave. "Then the mender becomes permanently tied to the alpha's well-being, and his to hers, in ways this text does not fully explain. It speaks of shared strength, shared vulnerability, and, if the old accounts are accurate, an unbreakable connection that lasts for the remainder of both their lives." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling heavily over all three of them. Alira stared down at her own hands, the same hands that had twice now pulled Roran back from the edge of death, and felt a fresh wave of fear and wonder crash through her in equal measure. She had come to Blackridge Keep as a frightened village healer, dragged in against her will to bandage a wound. Now it seemed, fate itself had marked her for something far larger, something ancient and binding that she had never asked for and barely understood. And somewhere down the corridor, in a chamber lit only by dying firelight, Roran Voss lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling above his bed, his healed hand pressed absently against his chest, wondering how deeply this strange, powerful pull he felt toward the quiet human healer ran, and whether it was truly fate's design at all, or simply his own heart finally recognizing something it had been searching for all along. News of the ancient legend spread through Blackridge Keep faster than Alira could have imagined possible. Within a week, she could not walk the corridors without noticing the shift in how people looked at her. Where suspicion had once dominated the whispers following her every move, something closer to awe had begun to take its place. Servants who had once avoided her gaze now bowed their heads respectfully as she passed. Guards who had watched her door with wary eyes now treated their post with something closer to genuine protectiveness. Not everyone had softened, however. Seraphine's hostility, if anything, had sharpened into something colder and more calculating since the revelation of the old legend. Alira had noticed her watching from across the great hall during meals, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes tracking every interaction between Alira and Roran with unmistakable, simmering resentment. "She isn't going to simply accept this," Miriam warned one afternoon, as the two of them worked together preparing salves in the healer's chamber. Seraphine has spent years cultivating support among the Eastern families, all built on the assumption that she would one day stand beside the king. A prophecy naming a human woman as his true match threatens everything she has worked toward. I never ask for any of this, Elira said, grinding dried lavender with more force than necessary. I didn't ask to be some ancient prophecy come to life. I just wanted to help him survive that first night. I know, Miriam said gently, but intention rarely matters to someone who feels they've lost something because of you, whether or not you meant to take it from them. Elira said nothing, though the words settled uncomfortably in her chest. She had never wanted to be at the center of a political struggle within a pack she barely understood, yet here she was, entangled in something far larger than herself, bound by threads of fate she had never chosen. Roran found her later that evening, sitting alone on the low stone wall overlooking the eastern hills, watching the last light of sunset fade into deep violet across the sky. He approached slowly, giving her space to notice him before he spoke. "You've been quiet today," he said, settling onto the wall beside her, careful to leave a respectful distance between them, despite the pull she suspected he felt as strongly as she did. "I've had a lot to think about," she admitted. "The legend," he said. It wasn't a question. "Among other things," she said, "your council watches me differently now. Your people watch me differently. I don't know if that's better or worse than the suspicion before." Roran was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "I understand the weight of being watched constantly, Elira. I have lived beneath that weight my entire life, since the day I became Alpha. Every decision scrutinized, every weakness magnified. It is exhausting and lonely in ways I don't often admit even to myself." "Is that why you've been kind to me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Because you understand what it feels like to be watched and judged for something you didn't choose." He turned to look at her then, his dark eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch. "I have been kind to you, Elira, because from the moment you walked into that hall and took charge of a room full of panicking wolves, I have found myself drawn to you in ways I cannot fully explain, and would have felt regardless of any prophecy or old legend. The bond, if it exists, may have connected our fates, but what I feel when I am near you is entirely my own." Elira's heart pounded painfully against her ribs. She had suspected, in quiet, unguarded moments, that the warmth building between them was not one-sided. Hearing him say it plainly, without hesitation or pretense, felt like something shifting permanently inside her chest. "I feel it too," she admitted softly. "I've tried to tell myself it's simply gratitude, or curiosity about the bond. But it isn't only that, is it?" "No," Roran said, his voice low. "I don't believe it is." Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them that evening, both too aware of everything still unresolved, the danger still circling them both. But something had shifted regardless, an understanding settling quietly between them, beneath the darkening sky, fragile and new, yet undeniably real. The following morning, Elira woke to the sound of raised voices, echoing from the courtyard below her window. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, finding a cluster of guards gathered near the main gate, their expressions tense. "What's happened?" she asked Callum, who stood near the edge of the group. "A messenger arrived at dawn," he explained, his voice low, "from the Ashwood Pack, our neighbors to the west. They're requesting an audience with the king regarding trade negotiations along the shared border. It's routine enough, but their timing feels suspicious given everything that's happened recently." Elira frowned. "You think they're connected to the poisoning?" "I don't know," Callum admitted. "But Edmund isn't taking any chances. He's insisted on doubling security throughout the keep until the Ashwood delegation departs." The delegation arrived that afternoon, led by a broad-shouldered wolf named Corwin, the Ashwood Pack's second in command, accompanied by a small retinue of guards and advisors. Elira watched from a distance as they were formally welcomed into the Great Hall, noting the careful, practiced diplomacy on both sides, masking whatever true tensions might lie beneath the surface. She was not present for the negotiations themselves, her role within the keep still too undefined for anyone to consider her presence necessary in matters of formal diplomacy. But she noticed, during the following days, the subtle shifts in mood throughout the keep, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she drew near, guards exchanging uneasy glances she couldn't quite decipher. It was Miriam who finally explained the source of the growing unease. Several evenings later, as they sat together in the healer's chamber, preparing for the following day's work. The Ashwood pack has long resented Blackridge's dominance over the western trade routes, Miriam explained quietly. There have been tensions simmering beneath the surface for years, carefully managed but never fully resolved. Some believe Corwin's sudden visit, so soon after an attempt on the king's life, is more than simple coincidence. You think Ashwood was responsible for the poisoning? Illyra asked, alarm creeping into her voice. I think, Miriam said carefully, that Edmund suspects it, though he has no proof yet. And I think, if his suspicions prove correct, this visit may be far more dangerous than any of us currently understand. Illyra thought of Roran, sitting through hours of careful, diplomatic negotiation, with a delegation that may very well have tried to end his life only weeks earlier, and felt a fresh wave of protective fear settle into her chest. Whatever fate had bound between them, whatever ancient legend had chosen her to stand beside him, she found she could not separate her growing feelings for him from her fierce determination to keep him alive, regardless of the danger that determination might invite into her own life as well. That night, as she lay awake listening to the distant sounds of the keep settling into an uneasy quiet, she found herself hoping, more fervently than she had hoped for anything in a long while, that whatever storm was building around them both would pass without claiming either of their lives in the process. She did not yet know how wrong that hope would prove to be. The Ashwood delegation remained at Blackridge Keep for nearly 2 weeks, far longer than the trade negotiations alone seemed to warrant. Illyra noticed the strain it placed on Roran, the careful mask of diplomacy he wore during long hours of formal discussion, slowly wearing thin by the time evening arrived each day. She began finding small ways to ease that strain, bringing warm tea to his study late in the evening, sitting quietly nearby while he worked through stacks of correspondence, offering conversation when he wanted it, and comfortable silence when he did not. It was during one such quiet evening that Callum arrived at the study door, his expression grim, a folded piece of parchment clutched in his hand. Your Majesty, he said, glancing briefly at Illyra before continuing, we found something, in the kitchens, hidden behind a loose stone near the pantry. Roran set down his quill immediately. Show me. Callum unfolded the parchment carefully, revealing a small collection of dried herbs wrapped inside, along with a note written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Illyra leaned closer, her stomach twisting as she recognized the herbs immediately. Nightshade root, she said quietly, ground fine enough to dissolve completely in wine, without altering the taste much. Whoever poisoned you knew exactly what they were doing. The note, Roran said, his jaw tightening as Callum passed it over. The message was brief, unsigned, written in a script none of them immediately recognized. It spoke only of payment received and further instructions to follow, nothing explicit enough to name a conspirator outright, but damning enough to confirm what Edmund had long suspected. This proves someone within the keep itself assisted whoever wanted you dead, Roran said grimly. Someone with access to the kitchens, someone trusted enough to move freely without suspicion. We're questioning the kitchen staff now, Callum said. But whoever hid this clearly expected it to remain undiscovered. They may not even realize we've found it yet. After Callum left to continue the investigation, Roran sat in heavy silence for a long moment, staring at the damning note in his hands. Illyra moved closer, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. You think it's someone close to you, she said softly. Someone you trust. I think, Roran said slowly, that whoever arranged this has been patient and careful, and is likely still within these walls. That thought troubles me more than the poison itself ever did. The kitchen staff were questioned extensively over the following days, though the investigation yielded frustratingly little. Whoever had hidden the evidence had done so carefully, leaving no obvious trail back to themselves. Edmund grew increasingly frustrated, his temper shortening noticeably as the Ashwood delegation's departure date approached without any clear resolution. Illyra, meanwhile, found herself drawn increasingly into Roran's daily life, no longer simply his healer, but something closer to a trusted confidant, someone he sought out, not out of necessity, but genuine desire for her company. She told herself repeatedly that she should maintain careful distance, mindful of everything that remained unresolved, the danger still circling them, the political complications her presence continued to create within the pack. Yet each evening found her drawn back to his study regardless, unable to fully resist the quiet pull she felt whenever she was near him. It was during one such evening, as autumn winds rattled softly against the study windows, that Roran finally voiced what had clearly been building between them for weeks. "I have spent my entire life being told that duty must come before desire," he said quietly, setting aside the correspondence he had been reviewing to look at her directly. "That an alpha's choices must always serve the pack first, personal feelings second. I have followed that guidance faithfully since the day I took this crown, but I find, increasingly, that I no longer wish to follow it where you are concerned." Alira's breath caught. "Roran, I am not asking you to answer tonight," he said gently, before she could find the right words. "I only wanted you to know how I feel, clearly, without the confusion of prophecy or ancient bonds clouding the truth of it. Whatever fate connected us that first night, my feelings for you now are entirely my own, chosen freely, regardless of what the old legends demand." She reached out and took his hand, the same hand she had once bandaged with trembling fingers, now strong and healed beneath her touch. "I feel the same," she said softly. "I have tried to convince myself otherwise, told myself it was simple gratitude or curiosity, but it isn't, is it? It never was." Roran lifted her hand gently to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "No," he murmured, "it never was." Their quiet moment was interrupted, as such moments so often are, by the sound of raised voices echoing from the courtyard below. Roran rose immediately, moving to the window, his expression shifting rapidly from tenderness to sharp alertness. "Something's wrong," he said, already moving toward the door. They found Edmund in the courtyard, standing over a young kitchen servant who had collapsed, clutching his stomach, his face pale with obvious pain. Miriam was already kneeling beside him, checking his pulse with practiced urgency. "He confessed," Edmund said grimly, as Roran and Alira approached. "Just before he collapsed. Said he'd been paid to hide the poison, to make certain it reached your cup, but he wouldn't name who paid him. Said if he did, they'd kill him regardless of what happened here." "Poison again," Alira said, kneeling quickly beside the young man, recognizing the same symptoms she had treated in Roran weeks before, though clearly self-inflicted this time, an attempt to silence himself before revealing more. She worked quickly, using what she had learned treating Roran to counter the toxin before it could take full effect, and though the young servant survived, he remained unconscious for the rest of the night, his secrets, for now, still safely locked away. "Someone within this keep is willing to kill their own conspirators to protect themselves," Roran said darkly, watching the unconscious servant being carried toward the healer's chamber. "This goes deeper than simple political rivalry with Ashwood. Someone close to me wants me dead badly enough to silence anyone who might expose them." Alira felt a cold chill settle over her, unrelated entirely to the autumn evening air. She thought of Seraphine's carefully veiled threats, of the resentment simmering behind her composed expression each time she looked at Alira across the great hall. She said nothing yet, unwilling to accuse someone without proof, but the suspicion settled uncomfortably in her chest regardless, refusing to fully release its grip for the remainder of that long, uneasy night. The young servant, a boy named Felix who had worked in the Blackridge kitchens for less than a year, remained unconscious for 2 full days, before finally stirring awake beneath Miriam's careful watch. Alira sat with him through much of that time, changing cool cloths against his forehead, monitoring the slow but steady recovery of his body from the poison he had turned against himself. When he finally woke, his eyes wide with fear and confusion, it was Alira's calm presence beside his bed that seemed to steady him enough to speak. "You're safe now," she said gently, offering him water. "No one here means you harm. But we need to know who paid you, Felix. Whoever it was tried to kill the king, and nearly succeeded twice now." Felix's hands trembled as he accepted the water, his young face pale with exhaustion and lingering fear. "I didn't know it would go this far," he whispered. "I needed the coin, my mother's ill, and the payment was more than I'd earn in a year working these kitchens. I never meant for anyone to die." "Who approached you?" Roran asked, having entered quietly, his expression carefully controlled, despite the tension radiating from his posture. Felix hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door as though expecting someone to appear and silence him permanently. A woman, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She never gave her name, wore a hooded cloak each time we met, always after dark. But I recognized her voice, Your Majesty. I've heard it often enough in these halls. Whose voice, Felix? Roran pressed, his tone gentle but firm. The boy swallowed hard before answering. Lady Seraphine's. The name settled heavily over the room. Illyra felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread wash through her, her earlier suspicions confirmed in the worst possible way. Roran's expression, meanwhile, had gone carefully blank. The kind of stillness she had learned meant he was suppressing something far more volatile beneath the surface. Are you certain? Edmund asked, having arrived just in time to hear the confession, his own face tight with disbelief and growing anger. I'm certain, Felix said miserably. I would know that voice anywhere. She promised the coin would solve all my family's troubles. She said no one would ever trace it back to her, that I only needed to hide the herbs where they'd eventually be found, to make it look as though someone acted alone. Why would she want it discovered at all? Illyra asked, confusion mixing with her growing anger. Perhaps, Edmund said slowly, because a failed, discovered attempt creates chaos and suspicion throughout the keep, weakening trust and stability, without directly implicating her so long as the trail ends with a frightened kitchen boy, rather than herself. Roran said nothing for a long moment, his jaw clenched tightly, his hands curled into fists at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a controlled fury Illyra had never heard from him before. Bring her to me, he said, now. Seraphine was brought to the council chamber within the hour, her composed expression faltering only slightly as she took in the grim faces awaiting her, Roran seated at the head of the table with an expression carved from stone. You wish to see me, Your Majesty? She asked, though her voice held a note of wariness that betrayed her carefully maintained calm. We know, Roran said simply. Felix has confessed everything. Your voice, your payment, your instructions for hiding the evidence where it would eventually be discovered. There is no point denying it further. For a long moment, Seraphine said nothing, her composure cracking slowly as the weight of the accusation settled over her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a bitter edge that had clearly been simmering beneath her polished exterior for far longer than Illyra had realized. You would have chosen a human over your own kind regardless, she said, her eyes flashing with anger and something close to genuine hurt. I saw it happening from the very first night, Roran. I have loved you since we were children together in these very halls, watched you become king, supported every decision you have made without hesitation, only to watch you fall for a stranger who arrived here by accident, bound to you by nothing more than old superstition. You tried to have me killed, Roran said, his voice deadly quiet. Twice. I never intended for you to die, Seraphine said, though her voice wavered, betraying the lie even as she spoke it. I only wanted her removed from your side before this prophecy could fully take hold, before the bond became permanent. The poison was meant to weaken you enough that you would recover slowly, giving me time to convince the council that a human healer, however gifted, had no place standing beside an alpha king. I never anticipated her ability would counter it so completely, so quickly. You endangered the entire pack for your own ambitions, Edmund said sharply, his disappointment evident despite his controlled tone. You have betrayed everything this keep stands for. Seraphine's gaze shifted to Illyra then, cold and unrepentant, despite the confession that had just sealed her fate. This isn't over, she said quietly, so only Illyra could fully hear the venom laced beneath her words. You may have won his heart for now, healer, but this pack will never fully accept you. Mark my words. Take her to the holding chambers, Roran commanded, his voice hard as stone. She will face full judgment before the council, once the Ashwood delegation has departed, and this matter can be handled without further complication. As the guards led Seraphine away, her final glance toward Illyra carried a promise of continued danger that settled uneasily in Illyra's chest, despite the relief of finally uncovering the truth behind the attempts on Roran's life. That night, once the chamber had emptied, and the immediate crisis had settled into uneasy resolution, Roran found Elira alone in the garden, staring up at a sky scattered with distant stars. "You were right to be suspicious of her," he said quietly, settling beside her on the familiar stone wall. "I should have listened sooner." "You couldn't have known for certain," Elira said gently. "She hid it well, for a long time." Roran reached over, taking her hand in his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. "I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that her plan failed, that you were here, twice now, to undo the damage she caused." "I'm grateful too," Elira admitted softly, "though I confess, I hope this is the last time my healing skills are tested quite so dramatically." Roran's mouth curved into a faint, weary smile. "As do I, though something tells me, given everything that has unfolded since your arrival, quiet peace may remain elusive a while longer yet." He was, though neither of them could have known it that night, entirely correct. Seraphine's confinement within the holding chambers would prove far less secure than anyone within Blackridge Keep believed, and the danger circling them both had not yet reached its final, most desperate turn. 3 nights after her confinement began, Seraphine vanished from the holding chambers without a trace. The discovery came at dawn, when a guard arrived to bring her morning meal and found the small stone room empty, the lock on the heavy door untouched, no sign of forced entry anywhere along the corridor. Panic spread quickly through the keep, once word reached Edmund, who immediately summoned every available guard to begin a thorough search of the grounds. Elira learned of the escape while assisting Miriam in the healer's chamber, the news delivered by a breathless young attendant whose wide eyes betrayed her fear even before she managed to explain what had happened. "She's gone," the girl said, gasping for breath. "Lady Seraphine. No one knows how. The door was still locked from the outside, but her chamber is empty." Elira's stomach dropped immediately, Seraphine's parting words echoing back to her with fresh, unsettling clarity. "This isn't over. You may have won his heart for now, but this pack will never fully accept you." She found Roran in the council chamber, already deep in tense conversation with Edmund and several senior guards, the mood in the room grim and urgent. "Someone helped her escape," Edmund was saying as Elira entered. "The lock shows no sign of tampering. Only someone with a key, someone trusted within these walls, could have released her without detection. Her family holds significant influence among the Eastern households," Roran said grimly. "It would not surprise me if she had allies still willing to assist her, even after her betrayal came to light." "What does this mean?" Elira asked, moving to stand beside him, her earlier unease sharpening into genuine fear. Roran's expression softened slightly as he turned to her, though the tension remained clear in the set of his shoulders. "It means we cannot be certain of her intentions, or her whereabouts. Given her earlier threats toward you, I want guards posted outside your door at all times, without exception, until we understand exactly what she intends." Elira nodded, though the reassurance did little to fully calm the anxious knot forming in her chest. For 2 days, the keep remained on high alert, extra patrols sweeping the surrounding forest and nearby villages in search of any sign of Seraphine. Nothing turned up. It was as though she had vanished entirely, swallowed by the vast wilderness surrounding Blackridge territory. Elira tried to maintain some semblance of normal routine during those tense days, assisting Miriam with her usual duties, walking the garden under the watchful eye of an ever-present guard, though the constant vigilance wore steadily at her nerves. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than usual, jumping at unexpected sounds, sleep coming to her only in fitful, restless bursts. On the 3rd evening, as she made her way back from the healer's chamber toward her quarters, guided by a young guard named Nathaniel, who had been assigned to her protection that night, she noticed something wrong the moment they turned into the narrow corridor leading to her room. The torch that normally burned steadily along the passage had been extinguished, plunging the hallway into unfamiliar darkness. "Stay close," Nathaniel murmured, his hand moving instinctively toward the blade at his hip, his senses sharpening as he scanned the shadows ahead. They had taken only a few more steps when the attack came, sudden and violent, figures emerging from the darkness with practiced speed. Nathaniel fought valiantly, but he was quickly overwhelmed by numbers, 3 armed figures descending on him before he could properly defend himself or call for help. Elira screamed, backing against the stone wall in terror as a rough hand seized her arm, a cloth soaked in something sharp and chemical pressed suddenly against her nose and mouth. The last thing she registered before darkness claimed her was the sound of Nathaniel's body hitting the floor and a familiar, cold voice murmuring something triumphant just beyond the edge of her fading consciousness. Illyra woke slowly, her head throbbing, her wrists bound tightly behind her back with rough rope that bit into her skin. She was lying on a hard dirt floor, the air around her damp and cold, the faint smell of animal fur and old smoke filling her senses as her vision gradually cleared. She was in some kind of den, she realized, deep underground, judging by the earthen walls surrounding her, lit only by a single flickering torch mounted near the entrance. Shadows moved beyond the dim light, and as her eyes adjusted further, she recognized the figure standing over her, arms crossed, expression cold and satisfied. "Awake at last," Seraphine said, crouching down to Illyra's level, her once immaculate appearance now roughened by days spent in hiding, though her eyes remained just as sharp and calculating as ever. "I did warn you this wasn't over." "Where am I?" Illyra demanded, struggling against her bindings despite the sharp pain it caused her wrists. "Rival territory," Seraphine said simply. "Allies who owed me favors, willing to shelter me in exchange for information about Blackridge's defenses. They have little love for Roran or his pack, which made this arrangement mutually beneficial." "You're working with an enemy pack now?" Illyra asked, horror creeping into her voice. "Seraphine, this goes far beyond removing me from the keep. This is treason against your own people." "I loved him," Seraphine said, her composed mask slipping briefly to reveal genuine, raw pain beneath. "I gave this pack everything, and it was never enough, not once you arrived. So now, I will take something from him instead. Once he learns you are here, in enemy hands, he will come for you himself, foolishly, without proper caution. And when he does, my new allies will finish what should have happened months ago." Illyra's blood ran cold as the full scope of Seraphine's plan settled over her. This was no longer simply about removing a rival. It was a trap, carefully constructed to lure Roran himself into mortal danger, using Illyra as bait. "He won't fall for something so obvious," Illyra said, though her voice trembled with uncertainty even as she spoke the words. Seraphine's smile carried no warmth whatsoever. "Won't he? You forget, healer, exactly how deeply that bond runs between you both. He will come. And this time, there will be no miraculous healing touch fast enough to save him." She rose and swept toward the den's entrance, leaving Illyra alone in the dim, damp darkness, her mind racing desperately for some way to warn Roran, to stop the trap being laid so carefully in his path. But bound and trapped as she was, deep within enemy territory, she had no way of knowing whether any warning could possibly reach him in time. Roran discovered Illyra missing within minutes of Nathaniel stumbling, bloodied and barely conscious, into the great hall, gasping out a warning before collapsing entirely. The young guard survived his wounds, though it took Miriam considerable effort to stabilize him, and the moment he was able to speak clearly, he confirmed everyone's worst fear. "Seraphine," he managed, his voice weak but certain. "I saw her face just before they struck me down. She took her, Your Majesty. Illyra is gone." Something shifted in Roran the moment those words left Nathaniel's mouth, a controlled, deadly calm settling over him that Edmund had witnessed only rarely in the years he had served as advisor, always in moments of the direst threat to the pack itself. "Gather every available tracker," Roran commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no hesitation or delay. "I want the forest searched immediately. Every trail, every scent. She cannot have gotten far without leaving some trace behind." The search moved swiftly, trackers fanning out across the surrounding wilderness within the hour, Roran himself leading the effort, despite Edmund's careful attempts to convince him to remain at the keep for his own safety. "You are the king," Edmund argued, struggling to keep pace as Roran strode purposefully toward the tree line. "If this is a trap, and it very likely is, you cannot simply walk into it unprepared." "I am aware it is likely a trap," Roran said, not slowing his pace. "But I will not sit within these walls while Illyra's life hangs in the balance, waiting for a rescue that might arrive too late. Send additional guards to follow at a distance if you must. But I am going after her, Edmund, and nothing you say will change that. Edmund, recognizing the futility of further argument, nodded grimly and began organizing a careful pursuit. A full contingent of enforcers following at a measured distance behind their king, ready to move the moment they were needed. The trail proved difficult to follow at first, Seraphine having taken careful measures to obscure her passage through the forest. But Roran's senses, sharpened by desperation and fury in equal measure, eventually picked up a faint trace of familiar scent leading toward the western border, deep into territory that bordered lands belonging to a rival pack long known for harboring resentment toward Blackridge's influence. By the time dusk began settling over the forest, Roran and a small group of his most trusted enforcers had reached the edge of enemy territory, the entrance to an underground den concealed cleverly beneath a rocky outcropping, guarded by several unfamiliar wolves who tensed immediately at their approach. "Stand down," Roran said, his voice carrying deadly authority, despite being vastly outnumbered by the gathering rival guards. "I know you are holding a human woman here against her will. Release her, and I am willing to discuss this matter through proper diplomatic channels rather than open conflict." The rival pack's guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not having anticipated the Alpha King himself arriving so quickly, or so boldly, despite the trap laid carefully in his path. Before further words could be exchanged, however, Seraphine emerged from the den's entrance, her expression triumphant despite the danger clearly evident in Roran's controlled fury. "You came," she said, "just as I knew you would." "Where is she?" Roran demanded, taking a threatening step forward, only to be halted by the sudden appearance of a dozen additional rival guards emerging from the shadows surrounding the den, weapons drawn. "Careful," Seraphine warned, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying nerves beneath her carefully maintained composure. "You are vastly outnumbered here, Roran. I would advise against foolish heroics." What followed happened with brutal speed. Roran's enforcers, having caught up just in time, surged forward the moment the rival guards moved to seize their king, and the narrow clearing erupted into chaos, snarls and shouts filling the darkening forest as both sides clashed violently. Roran fought his way toward the den entrance with single-minded determination, taking a glancing wound along his ribs from a rival blade that he barely seemed to register in his desperate need to reach Elira. Inside the den, Elira had heard the sounds of fighting erupt outside, her heart pounding with desperate hope and fear in equal measure. She struggled fiercely against her bindings, finally managing to loosen the rope enough to slip one hand free, just as the entrance to her prison burst open. Roran appeared in the doorway, bloodied but alive, his eyes finding hers immediately across the dim space. "Elira," he breathed, relief flooding his features as he rushed to her side, quickly working to free her remaining bindings. "You shouldn't have come alone," she said, though her voice broke with relief as his arms wrapped around her the moment she was free. "I could not have stayed away," he murmured against her hair, "not while your life was in danger." Their reunion was cut brutally short. A rival enforcer, larger and clearly more skilled than the guards Roran's men had already overwhelmed outside, burst into the den behind them, moving with lethal speed toward Roran's unguarded back. Elira's warning scream came a fraction of a second too late. The blade struck deep, tearing into Roran's side just below his ribs, far more severe than the glancing wound he had taken earlier. He staggered, blood pouring freely from the wound, his enforcers rushing in, moments later, to finally subdue the attacker. But the damage had already been done. Roran collapsed against the earthen floor, his breathing already growing labored, blood pooling rapidly beneath him. "No," Elira gasped, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands immediately pressing against the wound in a desperate attempt to slow the bleeding. "Roran, stay with me, please." His eyes, glassy with pain and rapid blood loss, found hers regardless, a faint, exhausted smile touching his lips, despite the severity of his injury. "You're safe," he managed. "That is all that matters." "Don't you dare," Elira said fiercely, tears streaming freely down her face, as she pressed both hands firmly against the wound, willing the strange warmth that had saved him twice before, to answer her desperate call once again. "Don't you dare give up on me now." She closed her eyes, pouring every ounce of her strength, every fragment of fear and love and desperate hope into her hands, refusing to accept any outcome other than his survival. This time, she did not simply allow the bond to happen to her, passive and uncertain as it had been before. This time, she chose it, fully and completely, embracing whatever ancient fate had connected them from that very first night. The warmth that answered her call was unlike anything she had felt before, powerful and overwhelming, spreading not just through her hands, but through her entire body, a golden light seeming to bloom beneath her palms, even in the dim, torch-lit den. Roran's ragged breathing steadied gradually beneath her touch, the horrific wound slowly, visibly beginning to close, muscle and skin knitting back together with impossible speed. Around them, the remaining rival guards and Roran's own enforcers alike stopped their fighting entirely, staring in stunned silence at the golden light radiating from Alira's hands, illuminating the entire den with an ethereal glow that spoke of something far older and more powerful than any of them had truly understood before that moment. When the light finally faded, Roran's wound had closed completely, leaving behind smooth, unmarked skin exactly as it had after his first injury, months before. His breathing had returned to normal, color flooding back into his previously pale face as his eyes opened fully, meeting Alira's with wonder and profound relief. "The bond," he whispered, understanding dawning slowly in his exhausted gaze. "You chose it, fully, this time." "I chose you," Alira said softly, tears still streaming down her face as she cradled his face gently in her hands. "Completely, and without hesitation. I love you, Roran. I think I have for longer than I've been willing to admit." Roran reached up weakly, pressing his palm against hers, and where their skin touched, a soft, glowing mark began to form, a delicate pattern spreading across both their palms simultaneously, sealing something ancient and unbreakable between them at last. "I love you too," he murmured, completely, and without hesitation. Outside the den, the remaining conflict had ended entirely, the rival guards surrendering quickly once their intended trap had so spectacularly failed, and Seraphine, having watched the entire scene unfold in stunned, horrified silence, was swiftly taken into custody by Roran's enforcers, her final, desperate gambit having cost her everything she had ever hoped to gain. The journey back to Blackridge Keep felt entirely different from the desperate ride Alira had taken months before, terrified and uncertain of what awaited her within those looming stone walls. This time, she rode beside Roran, his hand resting gently over hers for much of the way, the glowing mark on both their palms still faintly visible, a permanent reminder of the bond now fully sealed between them. News of what had happened at the rival den traveled quickly ahead of their return, and by the time they passed through the keep's iron gates, the entire courtyard had gathered to witness their arrival. Alira felt a flutter of nervousness settle in her chest as hundreds of eyes turned toward them, though the expressions she found waiting were nothing like the wary suspicion that had greeted her upon her very first arrival. Edmund stepped forward first, his weathered face carrying an expression of profound respect as he bowed his head toward Alira, a gesture she had never once received from him before that moment. "The Mender," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "Fate's chosen bond to our king, proven beyond any doubt, now that the ancient prophecy has fully realized itself before our very eyes. Blackridge owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd, though it carried none of the fear or suspicion Alira had grown accustomed to during her early days within the keep. Instead, she saw genuine warmth reflected in the faces surrounding her, wolves who had once regarded her with wary distrust, now looking upon her with something closer to reverence and gratitude. Miriam pushed through the crowd, embracing Alira tightly the moment she dismounted, tears of relief shining in her sharp eyes. "I was so afraid we had lost you both," she whispered. "Thank the stars you're safe." "Thanks to Roran," Alira said, glancing toward him with a soft smile. "He came for me himself, without hesitation." "As I always will," Roran said quietly, moving to stand beside her, his hand finding hers once again. Seraphine's judgment before the full council took place 3 days later, a somber affair conducted with the careful formality Blackridge traditions demanded, even for such a severe betrayal. Alira attended, Though she found little satisfaction in witnessing Seraphine's downfall, her earlier anger having softened somewhat into a complicated sympathy for the pain that had clearly driven such desperate, destructive choices. Roran, ultimately, chose exile rather than more severe punishment, a decision that surprised many among the council, but one Alira quietly supported. Seraphine would be stripped of her titles and standing within the pack, forced to leave Blackridge territory permanently, but her life would be spared, a mercy Alira suspected reflected Roran's own complicated feelings toward a woman he had known since childhood, however deeply she had betrayed his trust. "You could have demanded harsher justice," Alira said to him quietly, after the council had adjourned and Seraphine had been escorted from the keep for the final time. "No one would have questioned it." "Perhaps not," Roran agreed. "But I have learned, through everything that has happened these past months, that mercy freely given often carries more weight than punishment harshly enforced. Seraphine's actions were unforgivable in many ways, but her pain, however poorly expressed, was genuine. I would rather she carry the weight of her own choices going forward than carry the weight of her death on my conscience." Alira squeezed his hand gently, understanding, not for the first time, exactly why fate had chosen to bind her to a man capable of such measured, thoughtful compassion, even in the face of profound betrayal. The formal ceremony took place several weeks later, once autumn had fully settled over the surrounding hills, painting the forest in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Blackridge Keep had transformed for the occasion, banners hanging from every tower, the great hall decorated with more warmth and celebration than Alira had witnessed since her arrival. She stood at the top of the stone steps leading into the hall, dressed in flowing fabric the color of the autumn leaves outside, her heart pounding with nervous joy as she watched Roran approach from across the crowded courtyard, dressed in formal attire that suited his position as king, though his eyes, when they found hers, held nothing but the same warm affection she had come to know so intimately over the past months. "Ready?" he asked softly, offering his hand as he reached her. "I've never been more certain of anything," she said, taking his hand, the faint mark on both their palms glowing softly the moment their skin touched, as it always did now in moments of deep emotion between them. The ceremony that followed was simple by wolf tradition, focused less on elaborate ritual and more on the binding words exchanged between alpha and chosen mate before the assembled pack, words that formalized publicly what fate had already sealed between them weeks before, in a dim, dangerous den, far from these safe, familiar walls. "I, Roran Voss, Alpha King of Blackridge, take Alira Marsh as my chosen mate and queen," Roran said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, filled with genuine emotion rather than mere ceremonial obligation. "Bound by fate, chosen freely, and loved completely, for the remainder of our days. I, Alira Marsh." Alira echoed, her own voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Take Roran Voss as my chosen mate and king, bound by fate, chosen freely, and loved completely, for the remainder of our days." As their joined hands rose together before the assembled crowd, the mark on their palms glowed brightly enough for everyone present to witness clearly, a visible testament to the ancient bond now fully and permanently sealed between them. The hall erupted into cheers, wolves and the handful of human guests Alira had invited from her village alike, celebrating together with genuine, unrestrained joy. Later that evening, as the celebration continued below in the great hall, Alira and Roran slipped away to the quiet garden, where so much of their relationship had first taken root, standing together beneath a sky scattered with countless stars. "From bandaging your hand that very first terrifying night," Alira said softly, resting her head against his shoulder, "to standing here now, as your queen, I never could have imagined this path when I first walked through those gates, terrified and uncertain." "Nor could I have imagined," Roran murmured, pressing a gentle kiss against her hair, "that the woman who saved my life that night would come to hold my entire heart so completely. Whatever ancient fate connected us, Alira, I am endlessly grateful it led me to you." Below them, in the village at the edge of the forest, ordinary life continued as it always had, humans and wolves alike beginning to build a deeper trust between their two worlds, inspired in no small part by the unlikely bond between their king and the quiet healer who had once lived among them. And within the walls of Blackridge Keep, the scars that had once marked Roran's near-fatal wounds remained permanently absent, healed completely the moment Alira's hands had first touched him, a lasting symbol of a bond that had transformed both their lives forever, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal completely when met with a love chosen freely and without hesitation against every obstacle fate or fear could ever place before it.